February 1943, Port Moresby, Australian New Guinea, 06:20 hours. The humidity sits like a wet canvas over the field hospital tent, trapping the stench of sweat, disinfectant and something darker, the sweet rot of bodies losing their war against fever. Rows of canvas cots stretch into shadow, each one occupied by a soldier who should be holding a rifle, but instead clutches a thin blanket, shivering despite the oppressive heat. Some mutter incoherently, others lie perfectly still, eyes open but seeing nothing, locked inside the delirium that malaria brings in its third or fourth cycle. Captain James Hartley, Royal Australian Army Medical Corps, moves between the beds with a clipboard that grows heavier with each name he adds. 27 new admissions since midnight, 43 still down from the week prior. In his 18 months in theatre, he has signed more men off to hospital ships than he has returned to active duty. The mathematics are catastrophic. For every platoon fighting its way through the Owen Stanley Range, another lies here useless, burning with a fever that no amount of quinine can fully suppress. Outside, the jungle presses close. Dense, dripping, alive with mosquitoes that rise in clouds at dusk and dawn. Anopheles punctulatus, the vector. Hartley knows the Latin name, knows the life cycle, knows that every bite is a potential death sentence that takes weeks to kill. What he does not know is how to stop it. The standard issue quinine suppresses symptoms but fails to prevent relapse. Men return to duty only to collapse again days later, their red blood cells exploding under microscopic invasion, their organs shutting down one system at a time. He pauses beside Private Denning, 19 years old, from a dairy farm outside Gympie. Denning enlisted with his older brother in 1941. The brother died at Boona. Denning survived the Japanese, survived the bullets, survived the mortars, only to lie here now, skin yellow with jaundice, pulse rapid and thready, liver swollen hard beneath Hartley's fingers. There is nothing more to be done. Denning will be evacuated south on the morning transport. He will likely never return to active duty. Another name crossed off the roster, another rifle unmanned. Hartley steps outside into the pale dawn light. The air is no cooler, but at least it moves. Across the compound, engineers are unloading crates from a supply Dakota, its propellers still ticking as the engines cool. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, artillery thumps, a dull, distant percussion that never quite stops. The Japanese are still out there, dug into positions along the northern coast, waiting, but they do not need to attack. Time and disease are doing their work for them. The numbers tell the story that no amount of propaganda can obscure. In some forward units, malaria infection rates exceed 90%. Entire companies are combat ineffective, their men too weak to patrol, too feverish to hold a weapon steady. The 7th Division, which fought so stubbornly along the Kokoda track, has been bled white, not by enemy action, but by a parasite 1/100th the size of a pinhead. Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium vivax. Ancient killers, indifferent to flags or ideology, thriving in the equatorial heat. Hartley has written reports. So have a dozen other medical officers scattered across New Guinea, the Solomons, and northern Queensland. The reports move up the chain of command, gathering dust and urgency in equal measure. Everyone knows the problem. No one has a solution. Quinine is in short supply, its effectiveness questionable. Atabrine, the synthetic alternative, causes side effects that terrify the men. Yellowed skin, nausea, psychological disturbances. Rumors circulate that it causes impotence. Soldiers would rather risk malaria than risk that. They throw the tablets away. They trade them for cigarettes. They die. 1,200 kilometers south, in a laboratory at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Brigadier Neil Hamilton Fairley sits at a desk covered in blood smears, stained slides, and handwritten notes that map the progress of a disease through human tissue. Fairley is 51 years old, thin, relentless, with the kind of focused intensity that makes subordinates nervous and superiors impatient. He has spent 2 decades studying tropical diseases, blackwater fever in Macedonia, schistosomiasis in Egypt, malaria in India. He knows more about Plasmodium than perhaps any man alive. And he knows that the war in the Pacific will not be won by better guns or braver men. It will be won by whoever solves malaria first. The problem is time. Clinical trials take years. Controlled studies require stable populations, ethical oversight, reproducible conditions. There is no time for any of that. The Japanese are advancing. The Australians are dying. Fairley needs answers now, and he is willing to do what no ethical committee in peacetime would ever permit. He picks up a telephone. The call goes through 3 exchanges before reaching Army headquarters in Melbourne. Fairley speaks for 6 minutes. His tone is calm, factual, absent of emotion. He proposes a series of experiments that will involve deliberately infecting healthy volunteers with malaria, then testing suppressive drug regimens under controlled observation. The goal is not to cure the disease, that is impossible in the short term, but to prevent it. To find a protocol that keeps soldiers on their feet long enough to fight. To turn malaria from a Zhanchang executioner into a manageable hazard. There is a long silence on the other end of the line. Then a single question. How many volunteers will you need? Fairley glances at the notes in front of him. Hundreds, he says. Perhaps 1,000. We will need to test different strains, different drug combinations, different dosing schedules. We will need to infect them, observe them, measure their fevers, sample their blood. Some will become very ill, some may die, but if we do not do this, thousands will die anyway. The only difference is whether their deaths mean something. The voice on the other end asks one more question. Where will you do it? Fairley looks out the window at the Brisbane River, sluggish and brown in the summer heat. Somewhere quiet, he says. Somewhere we can control access. Somewhere the press will not find out until it is over. 3 weeks later, construction begins on a secure research facility at the Cairns Army Base in far north Queensland. Rows of isolation wards, laboratory benches, refrigeration units for blood samples, cages for mosquitoes, and beds, dozens of beds, waiting for the men who will lie in them willingly and let the enemy into their veins. The Pacific War is about to become a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons are microscopes and thermometers, where courage is measured not in yards gained, but in blood drawn and fevers endured, where young men will face an enemy that cannot be shot, cannot be bayoneted, cannot surrender. And in the center of it all, Neil Hamilton Fairley, a man who understands that science, like war, demands sacrifice. The jungle war is about to meet the laboratory, and nothing will ever be the same. April 1943. Cairns Army Base, far north Queensland. 13:40 hours. The isolation ward smells of carbolic soap and something faintly metallic, the scent of blood, drawn too many times from the same veins. 16 beds line the whitewashed walls, each separated by mosquito netting that hangs like translucent curtains in the still air. Every bed is occupied. Every man is a volunteer. Every volunteer is infected. Corporal William Mackenzie lies on bed 7, staring at the ceiling fan that rotates too slowly to provide relief. He is 23 years old, a loader from the docks in Fremantle, broad-shouldered and strong. 3 weeks ago, he was healthy. 2 weeks ago, he signed a consent form he did not fully understand. 10 days ago, a medical officer placed a glass feeding tube against his forearm and allowed 5 female Anopheles mosquitoes to feed until their abdomens swelled red. Mackenzie watched them through the glass, feeling the faint itch of insertion, knowing that each insect was delivering thousands of Plasmodium parasites directly into his bloodstream. For the first week, nothing. He felt fine. He wondered if the experiment had failed. Then, on day 8, the headache began, a dull pressure behind his eyes that aspirin could not touch. By day 9, his temperature spiked to 39 degrees. By day 10, the chills arrived, so violent that his jaw ached from clenching. Now on day 12, he cycles through fever and cold every 6 hours like clockwork, his body fighting a war it cannot win, his blood thick with parasites that reproduce inside his cells and burst outward in synchronized waves. A nurse moves through the ward with a metal tray, thermometers, syringes, glass slides. She stops at each bed, records temperatures, draws blood, smears samples onto slides that will be examined under microscopes in the laboratory next door. The data is everything. Fairley has designed the protocol with obsessive precision. Every fever is charted, every parasite count is logged, every dose of experimental suppressant is measured to the milligram. The men are not patients. They are instruments. Their suffering is the medium through which answers emerge. Fairley himself enters the ward twice daily, moving with the deliberate economy of a man who cannot afford distraction. He wears his brigadier's uniform without decoration, sleeves rolled to the elbows, stethoscope slung around his neck. He does not make small talk. He does not offer comfort. He examines each man with clinical detachment, checking spleens for enlargement, listening to lungs for fluid, palpating livers for tenderness. He asks questions. How many hours since the last rigor? Any visual disturbances? Blood in the urine? He records the answers in a leather notebook that never leaves his side. At bed 7, he pauses. Mackenzie's temperature is 40.1 degrees. His pulse is rapid, his skin flushed and dry. Fairley lifts the blanket and presses 2 fingers beneath Mackenzie's ribcage. The spleen is enlarged, hard as a fist, a bad sign. Fairley makes a note. Then he looks at Mackenzie directly for the first time. "You are doing important work," he says. His voice is flat, absent of warmth, but not unkind. "The data we are gathering from you will save lives. Hundreds of lives. Perhaps thousands." Mackenzie nods weakly. He wants to believe it. He volunteered because they told him it mattered. Because the alternative was watching his mates die in New Guinea without knowing why. Because someone had to do it. But lying here, shaking with cold in a room that feels like an oven, it is hard to feel heroic. It is hard to feel anything except sick. Fairley moves on. Bed 9, bed 11, bed 14. Each man is at a different stage of infection. Some are still in the early days, watching their fevers climb. Others are deep into the experiment, their blood so saturated with parasites that the smears look like abstract art under magnification. A few have been given atabrine in varying doses, their skin yellowing, their eyes bright with nausea. One man, Private Hooper, has developed cerebral symptoms, confusion, slurred speech, a vacant stare that suggests the parasites have crossed into his brain. He will be evacuated to Brisbane within the hour. Another data point, another variable measured. In the laboratory, 3 technicians work under hot lamps, counting parasites in blood films stained with Giemsa. The process is tedious, repetitive, essential. Each slide must be examined cell by cell, parasites tallied, stages identified. Rings, trophozoites, schizonts, gametocytes. The life cycle of Plasmodium plays out in miniature across glass rectangles, a slow-motion massacre visible only at 400 times magnification. The counts go into ledgers. The ledgers go to Fairley. Fairley converts them into graphs, tables, statistical models that reveal patterns invisible to the naked eye. What he is learning is this. Atabrine, when given at sufficient doses, can suppress parasitemia to nearly undetectable levels. But the dose required causes side effects severe enough that men will refuse it. The challenge is not pharmacological, it is human. How do you convince a soldier to take a drug that makes him feel worse in the short term, even if it saves his life in the long term? How do you balance efficacy with compliance? These are not questions that can be answered in a laboratory. They require testing in the field. They require command decisions. They require men like Mackenzie lying in bed 7, sacrificing their health so that others will not have to. By May, Fairley has data from over 200 infections. He has tested 6 different suppressive regimens. He has documented side effects, relapse rates, parasite clearance times, and organ damage. He has refined the atabrine protocol to a dosing schedule that balances effectiveness with tolerability. The results are promising. Not perfect, but promising. Enough to take to the field. He writes a report, 30 pages, dense with tables and statistical analysis. No rhetoric, no appeals to emotion. Just facts. The report goes to Army Medical Headquarters in Melbourne. From there it goes to MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command. Within 2 weeks, orders are issued. All forward units in the Pacific Theatre will begin mandatory atabrine suppression. Compliance will be enforced. Refusal will be treated as insubordination. The policy is controversial. Some medical officers object. Some soldiers resist. But the numbers do not lie. In units where atabrine suppression is enforced, malaria rates drop by 70% within 6 weeks. In units where it is not, infection rates remain catastrophic. The difference is stark enough that opposition fades. By August, atabrine is standard issue. By September, the tide is turning. Back in Cairns, Mackenzie is discharged from the isolation ward after 4 weeks of observation. He has lost 12 kilograms. His liver is still enlarged. His spleen will never return to normal size. He will carry the parasites in his blood for the rest of his life, dormant but not dead, capable of relapse at any moment. But he walks out under his own power. He is handed a certificate signed by Fairley, thanking him for his contribution to the war effort. It does not mention what he endured. It does not need to. He boards a train south, heading back to Fremantle. Through the window, he watches the Queensland coast slide past. Green hills, red soil, towns that have no idea what happened in that whitewashed ward. He thinks about the men still lying in those beds. He thinks about the men in New Guinea who will not get malaria because of what he and the others did. He does not know if it was worth it. He only knows it is done. And in Brisbane, Fairley is already planning the next phase. More volunteers, more strains, more questions. The war is not over. The science is not finished. There is still so much to learn, and so little time to learn it. The fever breaks, but the work does not stop. September 1943. Lae, Australian New Guinea. Irate 115 hours. The landing craft beaches on black volcanic sand under a sky heavy with smoke. Soldiers of the 9th Division pour out into knee-deep surf, rifles held high, boots finding purchase on a shoreline that 2 months ago would have been a killing ground. But today, there is no resistance. The Japanese have withdrawn inland, their positions overrun, their supply lines severed. The Australians advance through abandoned bunkers and shattered palm groves, moving with a speed and endurance that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Lieutenant David Shaw, 215th Battalion, leads his platoon through the tree line and into the humid interior. He is 26 years old, a schoolteacher from Albury, who enlisted in 1940 and fought at Tobruk before being redeployed to the Pacific. He has seen men die from bullets, shrapnel, and drowning. But the worst deaths he has seen were from malaria, slow, feverish, undignified collapses that turned soldiers into shadows. He lost a third of his company to the disease during the Kokoda campaign. Men who could march 40 kilometers through jungle and fight hand-to-hand against Japanese infantry, brought down by something they could not see or shoot. But not this time. Shaw's platoon has been on mandatory atabrine suppression since July. Every morning, without exception, each man swallows a small yellow tablet under the supervision of a corporal who checks mouths to ensure compliance. The men complain. The tablets turn their skin faintly yellow. Some report nausea, headaches, vivid dreams, but they do not collapse with fever. They do not shake with rigors in the middle of the night. They do not evacuate to field hospitals, wasted and delirious. They stay on their feet. They fight. Shaw checks his watch. 2 hours since the landing. No casualties, no breakdowns. His men are moving through terrain that would have been a death sentence a year ago, and they are doing it at combat speed. This is what Fairley's experiments have brought them. Not immunity, there is no such thing, but resilience. The ability to operate in malarial zones without being destroyed by them. The ability to sustain an offensive instead of watching it dissolve into a medical catastrophe. 300 kilometers south in Port Moresby, the statistics are being compiled in a headquarters tent that smells of mildew and typewriter ribbon. Major Peter Langley, Army Medical Corps, sits at a field desk reviewing casualty reports from the past 3 months. The numbers are astonishing. Malaria admissions are down 68% across all units in theatre. Hospital ship evacuations have dropped by half. Combat effective strength has remained stable for the first time since the campaign began. The correlation is undeniable. Atabrine suppression works. Langley lights a cigarette and reads through the operational summaries. The capture of Lae, the advance on Finschhafen, the encirclement of Japanese positions at Sattleberg. None of it would have been possible without healthy troops. Without atabrine, these offensives would have stalled as they had before, not from enemy resistance, but from battalions melting away into fever wards. The drug has not ended malaria, but it has neutered it, turned it from a strategic weapon into a manageable hazard. He thinks about the men who made this possible, the volunteers at Cairns, The ones who let themselves be infected, who endured weeks of suffering so that protocols could be tested and refined. Their names are not in the operational reports. Their sacrifices will not appear in any official history. But every soldier who walks off a beach without collapsing, every platoon that holds a position without half its number shivering in a tent, owes them a debt that will never be recorded. In Brisbane, Fairley receives the field reports with the same clinical detachment he brings to everything. He reads them carefully, makes notes, files them in sequence. The data confirms what the laboratory experiments predicted. The suppression protocol is effective, the side effects are tolerable, the strategic impact is measurable. It is the outcome he worked for, but he does not celebrate. There is no time, there are still questions to answer. Resistance patterns, long-term toxicity, relapse prevention. The war will end eventually, but malaria will not. The fight will continue in different forms in different places, long after the last shot is fired. He writes a letter to the volunteers at Cairns. It is brief, formal, devoid of sentiment. He thanks them for their contribution. He informs them that their data has been instrumental in developing protocols now used throughout the Pacific Theatre. He does not tell them how many lives they have saved. He does not know. The number is uncountable. By November, the Allied advance has pushed the Japanese back across New Guinea. By December, Bougainville is under assault. By January 1944, the Philippines are in sight. At every stage, Australian and American forces move through jungles that once would have annihilated them. They still suffer. Malaria still infects, but it no longer destroys. The parasites are in their blood, suppressed but present. Held at bay by daily doses of a synthetic compound developed in a German laboratory in the 1930s and refined through brutal trial in an Australian isolation ward in 1943. The war grinds on. The jungle does not relent, but the balance has shifted. Fairley's experiment, ethically dubious, scientifically rigorous, desperately necessary, has changed the calculus of combat in the tropics. The invisible enemy has not been defeated, but it has been outmaneuvered, and that makes all the difference. In Fremantle, William Mackenzie returns to the docks. His body has mostly recovered. His spleen is still enlarged. He still carries the parasites, dormant in his liver, waiting. He does not talk about Cairns. He does not explain the faint yellow tinge that never quite leaves his skin. When people ask where he served, he says New Guinea. He does not mention the isolation ward. He does not mention the mosquitoes in the glass tube. He does not mention the fevers that nearly killed him. He reads the newspapers. He follows the Allied advance across the Pacific. He watches the maps change, the front lines shift, the Japanese positions collapse. He knows, in a way that no one else around him can understand, that he is watching the results of his own blood. That every kilometer gained, every position held, every soldier who does not collapse with fever is connected to what he endured in that whitewashed room. It is not glory. It is not recognition, but it is something. A quiet knowledge that when his country needed him to fight an enemy that could not be shot, he lay down in a bed and let the enemy in. And by doing so, he helped to turn the tide. Years later, after the war, Fairley will be knighted for his contributions to tropical medicine. He will publish papers that become foundational texts in parasitology. He will lecture at universities, advise governments, shape public health policy across the Commonwealth. But he will never speak publicly about the ethics of what he did at Cairns. He will never defend it, never apologize for it. He will only say that war demands impossible choices, and that the measure of those choices is not comfort but consequence. The volunteers will scatter. Some will die in later battles. Some will live long lives carrying the scars of malaria in their organs and their memories. None will be famous. Few will be remembered. But their contribution will endure in ways they could never have imagined. In protocols that saved tens of thousands of lives. In lessons that shaped military medicine for generations. In the quiet knowledge that science, like courage, sometimes requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things. The Pacific War was won on beaches and in jungles, in the air and on the sea. But it was also won in a laboratory in Brisbane and an isolation ward in Cairns, where men with microscopes and men with fevers fought a different kind of battle. A battle without glory, without witnesses, without end. And in that battle, Australia stood at the front line, not with guns but with test tubes, not with bombs but with blood. And when the fever finally broke, the world kept turning, indifferent and ungrateful. But the men who were there, the ones who survived, they knew. And that was enough.